All right, good morning once again. If you would open your Bible to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 26. This morning we're going to be in verses 1 to 16. We finished our three parts, I guess you call it series, if you will, on David and Abigail. And this morning we return to the story of David and Saul, which is interwoven all throughout the book of the second half of 1 Samuel. The title of the sermon is History Repeats Itself. History repeats itself. I'm going to read the text as we go through it in the exposition because it's a little bit longer of a text. So I'm going to open us in a word of prayer. We'll read the text, I'll do exposition, and I'll give application at the end, and then we'll take the Lord's Supper this morning. So if you will, pray with me, and then we'll jump into the sermon this morning. God, I pray as we return to the story of David and Saul, God can help us to continue learning from these two characters, Lord, from David's faithfulness, Lord, the faithfulness that was very much intermingled with his unfaithfulness, but that overall, God, you were faithful in his life to preserve his faithfulness. And Saul, such a tragic character, God, help us to learn from his mistakes and from his life and just what a tragic story it is that we would see Saul and know that this is not our story, that this is not who we are in Christ, that this is who we could have been. God, help us to see that this morning, that we could have been Saul. Any of us could be Saul, but by your grace, God, we are not, that we are afforded all the rights and privileges that David was, that we are made sons and daughters of the King of Kings. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. We love sequels. This was proven true this past weekend by the movie Top Gun Maverick, which broke Memorial Day box office records, taking in $165 million in one weekend. That's a lot of money for a movie to take in one weekend. Of the top grossing films of all time, 18 out of 25, 72% are a sequel or a remake. Now, I personally don't like sequels. But we as a society love them, apparently. What is our fascination with sequels or remakes? I think in part it's because we don't want the story to end. But I think it's also because we want to know, how does the story end? Did the character redeem themselves and learn from their mistakes? Or is history doomed to repeat itself? This morning we get to a sequel. If you haven't seen David, Saul in the cave, let me encourage you later today to read 1 Samuel 24. Because like all good sequels, you have to watch the original first. This morning, we get to David and Saul, part 2. God had previously delivered Saul into David's hand in the cave, and Saul barely escaped with his life in 1 Samuel 24. But to quote a cliche, history repeats itself. And that's what we're going to see this morning. So let's look at our text. 1 Samuel 26, let's look at verse 1 here. We'll go through it section by section. 1 Samuel 26:1. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon?" Let's stop right there. Now, it's unclear how much time passes between chapters 24, 25, and 26. So we don't know how much time has passed. But verse 1 is really kind of like deja vu, isn't it? Back in chapter 23, verse 19, here's how it reads. Then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds of Horish on the hill of Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon?" We just read that. It happens again. Now keep in mind, the Ziphites are Israelites. They are David's own countrymen. This betrayal by the Ziphites twice is what prompts David to write Psalm 54. And in Psalm 54, David describes the Ziphites as insolent men who have risen up against him. They are ruthless. They seek his life. They do not set God before them. Now, at this point, I want us to pause right here, and I want us to consider this question. What should Saul do with this information? The last time that Saul was given intel about David's whereabouts, he pursued the intel. He pursued it all the way into a cave where he was delivered into David's hands. And now he's given the exact same intel. Now Saul has two options. A, he could tell the Ziphites, I've been down this road before. I almost died. Like, see my robe? Guys, come here. Look at my robe. Yeah, I almost died. I'm not going down this again. Or B, he could say, I've been given a second chance to kill my enemy. Which of the two options is Saul going to take? Look at verse 2. So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul takes option B. Now make no mistake, Saul's not going to the wilderness to have a conversation with David. Saul is going there to kill David. This is why he takes 3,000 chosen men, 3,000 of the best fighters in Israel with him. Now David's army is only 600. So Saul outnumbers David 5-1. Look at verse 3-5. Saul encamped on the hill of Hakilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay with Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. So David gets word that Saul has come to the area. Now he's not sure if this is true, so he sends out spies just to confirm the report. The spies come back, they confirm the report. It's true. Saul and his men are indeed in the area. Now normally the pattern has been is that whenever Saul was on the move, David was on the move. So Saul moves, David moves. Saul moves, David moves. But here, David doesn't move. David doesn't flee. He actually does quite the opposite. He draws near to Saul's camp. He sees the army with Saul and Abner. Now, who is Abner? Well, he's Saul's cousin. If you remember, we saw Abner in the story of David and Goliath. That's who Saul asked, well, who is this son of Jesse? He sits by Saul's side at the dinner table. Now, it was custom in those days that the king would sleep in the middle of the army. So there'd be an entire army encampment. He would sleep right in the middle so that he's fully defended all around him. So here's Saul, here's Abner. They're in the middle of the camp, and surrounded him are 3,000 men. Not just any 3,000 men, like the 3,000 chosen men, like 3,000 Navy SEALs or Green Berets. He's very well protected. Look at verse 6-7. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp of Saul? And Abishai said, I'll go down with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Now here we're introduced to two new characters. The first is Ahimelech the Hittite. Now we know nothing about him except he's a Hittite. What's interesting is because the Hittites were previously devoted to destruction. But here's one of them serving in David's army. That leads us to believe he had become a follower of Yahweh, I assume. The other is Joab's brother, Abishai. Who is Abishai? Abishai is David's nephew. Both him and Joab will have roles to play in 2 Samuel. We won't get to 2 Samuel, but if you read that, you'll see him and Joab in 2 Samuel. Now, David asks a question. Who will go down with me into the camp of Saul? Notice Ahimelech's like, not me. Now just think about that question. This is like standing on a hill, looking down into a valley, and seeing a pack of lions sleeping. and someone says, hey, who wants to go down with me into the den of lions? Ahimelech doesn't speak up, but Abishai says, I will. I'll go down with you. So both of them go down to Saul's army by night. They are walking into an enemy camp. And they see Saul sleeping in the middle of the camp. His spear is stuck in the ground next to his head, presumably so that he can grab it quickly and use it if he needs to. And Abner, his commander, is by his side. Look at verse 8. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now, please, let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. Now, Abishai's statement, it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Remember back in chapter 24, verse 4, the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him what seems good to you. Abishai has the exact same interpretation of events that his men did in chapter 24. Now, it wasn't that Abishai's statement was false. God had given Saul into David's hands. That's true. The question is what to do with it. What do I do with this? Abishai recognizes his place in the army. He doesn't act, but he asks David for permission. He says, let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. In other words, I only need one blow. I wonder though, I thought about this. If he does this, how are they going to get out alive? I mean, I'm sure people are going to wake if he does this. Aren't they isn't this a suicidal mission? I don't know. At this point, David has a choice. It's the exact same choice that he has in the cave. With one strike of the spear, David can go back to sleeping on a bed, eating royal food, enjoying fellowship with his best friend, and walking down the street without constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering is somebody going to kill him. Now, if you're David, you have to be thinking, listen, I've already shown you mercy once, Saul. Like, you came into this cave, I could have killed you, I showed you mercy once, I let you go free, you said that you were sorry, and you keep coming to kill me. So perhaps this time David will feel justified. Maybe David will be like, listen, it's clear that he's not going to stop. Take him out. Is that what David's going to do? Look at verse 9. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him. For who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Sound familiar? Chapter 24, verse 6. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. Even though Saul is a rejected king, even though he's a wicked king, even though he is a murderous king, he's still the king. He is still God's anointed. David believes that God will hold him accountable for killing God's anointed. But we see this roller coaster ride that David is on, don't we? I mean, if you have to kind of read chapters 24, 25, and 26 together to see this roller coaster. 24, David shines in showing mercy to Saul, and then he begins to plummet when he decides to kill Nabal. And then God protects him, and then he shines again in protecting and showing mercy to Saul. That's all throughout David's life. It wasn't that David was this, flawless character. He had so many flaws. But God was faithful to persevere his faith, to hold him and keep him. Look at verse 10. And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. Now, verse 10, man, this is such a beautiful picture of a man who trusts the sovereignty of God. I have to wonder if what happened to Nabal influenced David's perspective here. If you remember when Abigail told her husband about all that she did, what happened to Nabal? Nabal's heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. And perhaps that incident led David to the conclusion, Listen, Abishai, the Lord will strike him. Or he'll die of natural causes. Or he will die in battle. But I don't have to expedite his death. Now, David has given us a foreshadowing of what is to come, because we get to the end of 1 Samuel and we will see this is exactly what does happen. David's point, though, is I don't have to take matters into my own hands. I can trust God's hand. Verse 11. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. Now, David repeats his phrase from chapter 24. He says, the Lord forbid. In other words, he is firm in his decision. He's not wavering in this decision. Instead of just going back to camp, though, David tells Abishai to take Saul's spear and his water jug. Now, two questions arose in my mind. Number one, why does David do this? Is he just like, want a spear? He's like, no, I like that spear. We will soon learn that David does this to once again give evidence to Saul that he could have killed him. If he was able to creep into the middle of their camp of 3,000 men, take his spear, take his water jug, and walk away, then he most certainly could have killed Saul. And then two, my second question was, how is this different than cutting off a piece of his robe? In chapter 24, when David was in the cave, David, remember, he stealthily crept up on Saul, cut off a piece of his robe, but then as soon as he did it, his conscience struck him, and he decided, that this was wrong. How is this any different? I mean, in one sense, it's just a piece of a robe, man. I need my spear and my water jug. How is this any different? It may be different in one of two ways. A, it may be different in the symbolism of the act. The cutting off of the robe may have been intended to signify a transfer of power from Saul to David, a transfer of power that God was not ready to give. So that may be why it was wrong. Or B, it may be different in that when David cut off a corner of Saul's robe, at that point, David was planning to kill Saul. I mean, we're not told, but it may be that in that moment, he was going to kill Saul. He cut off the corner of his robe, but then his conscience struck him, and he realized, and he said, I can't do this. This would be wrong. And God protected him. Here, it sounds like there is no wavering in his mind. He is resolute. He says, I'm not going to kill the Lord's anointed. Take his spear, take his water jug, so we can show him that once again, we have spared him. Look at verse 12. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. I love when narrators give us these kind of details. I love it. It's one of the reasons why I love the Old Testament so much, because it's as if we are given a peek behind the curtain of God's sovereignty. Sometimes we read stories in the Old Testament and we wonder, how is this possible? Imagine if we were not given verse 12. Imagine if the narrator didn't give us its detail. You know what we would think? How are you creeping to a camp of 3,000 people and not one person woke up? I wake up 6 times in the night. I got to go to the bathroom. I had a drink of water. 3,000 people, not one person had to go to the bathroom. Not one person rolled over and just was like, These kind of details show us that God is always working behind the scenes. No man saw it, no man knew it, nor did any awake. How is this possible? Because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. This phrase, deep sleep, it's the same word used in Genesis 2:21, when God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep. And he took his rib out and made Eve. We see that God is helping David. Look at verse 13 to 16. Then David went over to the other side, stood far off on the top of the hill with a great space between them. And David called to the army and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered, who are you who calls to the king? And David said to Abner, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die because you have not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is at and the jar of water that was at his head. Now David and Abishai, they make sure they have enough space between them and Saul, and they call out. Now David, rather than address Saul, he addresses Abner's commander. Abner asks, who is that? He's yelling at them. But David doesn't identify himself. He takes the opportunity to ridicule Abner. David's ridiculing Abner. He says, are you not a man? Aren't you a man? Man, that's like the worst insult, but like to say to a man. Who is like you in all of Israel? The commander of the army has one job and one job only, to protect the king. That's your job, Abner. And David says, you failed at your job, which is ironic coming from David, because had Abner not failed, David would be dead. It's kind of funny. You should have killed me, Abner. You should. David tells Abner that he deserves to die. Now, this is ironic foreshadowing as well, because in 2 Samuel, Abner actually becomes an ally to David, but Joab and Abishai kill him. So David's words come true, just not as he wanted them to. And we'll stop right there with our text. Application. I have 6 exhortations for you. 6 exhortations. Number 1. The first one comes from Proverbs 26:11. Like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. Like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. Proverbs 26:11. As I mentioned in the exposition, when the Ziphites came to Saul and they told him, they said, hey, we spotted David again. Saul has 2 choices in this moment. A, he can tell them, listen, I've been down this road before, guys. I almost died. I'm not going down it again. Or B, he could say, oh man, I've got another chance. Like I barely escaped the first time, but this time I'll get him. Saul had previously made a foolish choice to seek out David, and he almost died as a result. And you would think that that would be enough for him to wise up. But like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. We all make mistakes. Everybody in this room makes mistakes. We all mess up. We all sin. The question is, do we continue to make the same mistakes? Do we learn from them? I was thinking about this phrase, a dog returns to his vomit. You ever see a dog return to its vomit? It's gross. It is. And it gets worse with dogs. Jolene can attest to that. It's gross. That's what it's like when we return to our sin. You look at that dog and you're like, I bought premium dog food for you. Like, vomit? Like, really? It's what it's like when we return to our sin. Two, God uses past failures as a means of grace to not repeat history. God uses past failures as a means of grace to not repeat history. You know, I was talking with Lauren about chapter 25, what we went through over the past 3 weeks, and how God restrained David from sin. And the question that she had was, well, I'm sure it's a question that many of you had, was this: why does God restrain sin sometimes and not other times? Like, why does God do that? Why did God restrain David with Nabal, but he didn't restrain him with Bathsheba? Why did God restrain David with Saul, but he didn't restrain him with the census? I suppose on one level we could answer human responsibility or human choice, that we make real choices. Of course, that doesn't really answer the question though, does it? Doesn't explain why does God allow us to make real choices at some times and then other times he restrains us. So on another level, we have to leave this up to the mysterious providence and the providential mystery of God. We have to leave it at that on one level. But I want to give one possibility. You're like, well, that thank you very much. That doesn't help. All right. Let me give you one reason why I think God may ordain for us to fail at times. You say, why does God ordain that I would fail at times? Why? Let me give you one reason why I think possibly. And the reason is because God uses our failures as a means of grace to not repeat history. This was true for both Saul and David. David had failed, albeit small, when he crept up on Saul and cut off a corner of his robe. That was wrong. He was immediately struck to the heart and repented of it. He then failed again when he ordered his men to strap on a sword and ride for Nabal's house to kill every last male. And had Abigail not intervened, David would have been guilty of bloodshed. But God prevented him. And I think those two previous incidents were God's means of grace for David to not give in to the temptation to let Abishai kill Saul. I think those two incidents, like God used in his life to say, no. I almost killed Nabal. Like I could see his house. Like I was right around the corner. The same is true for Saul. Saul had failed in his foolish pursuit of David in the wilderness, and Saul barely escaped with his life. And this failure was God's means of grace when the Ziphites came to him. Saul could have said, listen, guys, I've been down this road before. I'm not going down it again. I think about that every time, like when my wife is gone and I'm home alone and I'm tempted to look at something I shouldn't look at. That's what I think is, I've been down this road before. I'm not going down it again. I know where this leads. I'm not going down this road again. It's a black hole. But Saul rejects God's grace. I've often wondered, why did Jesus allow Satan to sift Peter? You ever think about that? Remember, Jesus comes to Peter and says, behold, Simon, Satan has demanded to sift you. Actually, all the disciples. Now, what's the simplest answer Jesus can give? No. No, you may not. You may not sift them. His answer was yes. Jesus says, you may. Now, that's not recorded, but that is what his answer was. Why did God allow him to sift him, knowing that Peter's going to fail? Jesus, we know he knows because he predicted the future. He said, you're going to deny me. He knew that Peter would fail, so why did he allow this? Because I think the failure was God's means of grace in Peter's life. As far as we know, Peter never denied Christ again. He never denied him again. And in fact, in the early church, before Paul is saved, it is Peter who is boldly proclaiming the gospel. Read the first half of Acts. Peter is the one front and center declaring the gospel boldly, and he almost died for it. Remember, James was arrested. Herod arrested James, had him beheaded. He saw that it pleased the Jews. He's like, oh man, this got me favor. All right, Peter next. He arrests Peter. Peter's in jail. He's up on the chopping block, literally. And an angel rescues him, busts him out of jail. How did Peter go from denying Christ 3 times to a willingness to be beheaded for the faith? How? God's grace in his life. God's grace in his life. God used his past failures to strengthen his faith. God uses our past failures as grace in our life that we wouldn't repeat our history. That we would say, I've been down this road. I'm not going down it again. 3, God's sovereignty presents a choice to twist it or to trust in it. God's sovereignty always presents a choice to twist it or to trust in it. There's no doubt that God's sovereignty was at work in these 2 encounters in chapters 24 and chapters 26. David's own men say in 24:4, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand. And Abishai says in chapter 26:8, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. So 2 times, God had clearly given Saul into David's hand. Now this sovereign handing over by God to David presents a choice to trust in God's sovereignty or to twist God's sovereignty. David could twist this. He could be like, yeah, man, like God sovereignly set this up. I'm supposed to kill Saul. We all face this choice today, don't we? Especially when tragedy hits. We believe that God is sovereign. We believe that God controls all things. And so there is a temptation for even the church to twist this. To think God doesn't care. Or worse, God is cruel. This can happen in countless ways. I hear it in the church, not necessarily our church, but the church, capital C. We trust that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. And so if I'm born with a proclivity to same-sex attraction, Satan will come and twist that. God made me this way. Pastor, you said God is sovereign, right? So he made me this way, right? So he must approve of this. And if he made me this way, then he approves of it. No. I got pregnant when I didn't want to. We talked about this on Friday night. Is it okay for a woman who gets raped to get an abortion? That was one of the questions submitted and I asked the pastor. God is sovereign, right? No, he's not sovereign. This wasn't God's plan. So an abortion is okay. It's okay for me to get an abortion because God did not want this to happen. That's the argument. God's sovereignty is one of the most twistable theologies in the church. What other reason would God serve Saul on a silver platter to David if not to kill him? If David doubted the first time, here it is again. He's like, oh man, maybe I was supposed to kill him in the cave. Oh my gosh. I thought I was supposed to be merciful. Okay, here he is. All right, Abishai. We always have a choice to take matters into our own hands or to trust God's hand. Always. 4, as much as we wish otherwise, temptation often gets stronger, not weaker. As much as we wish otherwise, temptation often gets stronger, not weaker. I wonder, what was the greater temptation for David? The first incident in chapter 24 or the second in chapter 26? Now, this is a debatable point. You might disagree, and that's okay. I'll just give my opinion. The text doesn't say. But I think that the second incident was a stronger temptation. And the reason is because the first one happened so fast, didn't it? David and his men are just sitting in the cave, minding their own business, and all of a sudden, there is Saul. He's by himself, taking a nap, and David is all of a sudden has to make a choice. But in the second incident, David has been given conclusive proof that Saul is not going to let this go. I mean, if David escaped the first time, but then when Saul's back in the desert, David realizes he's not going to let this go. Like, this man is not going to stop until either he is dead or I am dead. One of us is going to die, but he's not going to stop until one of us is dead. That would have been a temptation. Maybe more than the first. Which is perhaps why he initiates the encounter. When he gets to Saul's camp, and think about this too. If you thought that this was God's sovereignty to be in a cave where Saul just happened, like, man, what are the odds of that? That Saul would pick the exact same cave that I'm in? Now that's God's sovereignty, but that you could walk into an enemy camp of 3,000 men without anybody waking up, that's even more incredible, isn't it? And so the temptation would have been so thick. And all of a sudden, as he walks into the camp, he sees something out of the corner of his eye. What does he see? He sees Saul's spear. Oh yeah, I know you. Consider the poetic justice of this scene. We're old friends. That's the same spear he threw at me multiple times to kill me. That's the same spear he threw at my best friend, his own son, to kill him. There it is. Oh yeah, you want to throw this spear at me? You want to throw this spear at your son? Yeah? What poetic justice would it be for David to kill Saul with his own spear? All David has to do is nod his head and Saul is dead. As much as we wish otherwise, temptations often get stronger, not weaker. So how did he not give in to the temptation? How did he not give in? Number 5. Where temptation abounds, God's grace abounds more. Now, I understand the passage in Romans is where sin abounds, God's grace. In case anybody's like, that's not what the text says. I understand that. But I think it's also true that where temptation abounds, God's grace abounds more. What was the grace working in David's life at this moment? When he walks into the camp, he's standing right there. He realizes that God has sovereignly delivered Saul into his hands. What was the grace that restrained him from doing this? I don't know, but here's what I think it is. Nabal's stroke. I think it was Nabal's stroke. David says, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. Now, where does that kind of confidence come from? About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Temptation may get stronger at times, but temptation and God's grace are not inversely related. Where the stronger the temptation, the weaker the grace. No, they are directly related. The stronger the temptation, the stronger the grace. Every trial that we go through, every failure, every tragedy, God is able to use that in our life to remind us that giving in to sin will never satisfy. And so we must have eyes to see in the moment that when the temptation, and we all know this, right? The temptation is so strong to lash out with our tongue or to withhold forgiveness or to lie on our taxes or to commit sexual immorality. In that moment, to recognize God's grace is sufficient in this moment. I don't have to give in to this. I don't have to give in to this. 6, last point. God doesn't need weapons. He just needs sleep. God doesn't need weapons. He just needs sleep. I love how God displays his power in the Old Testament. I love it. Egypt has 600 chosen chariots, and God defeats them with some mud. Jericho has thick walls, and God defeats them with a marching band. The Philistines had enslaved the Israelites, and God defeats them with an ox goad and a blind man. The Midianites have thousands and thousands with swords, and God defeats them with 300 men with some jars and some trumpets. Saul has 3,000 chosen men, and God defeats him with what? Some sleep. Saul is doing everything he can. He's sparing no expense, sparing no amount of effort to kill David. And God defeats Saul. He shows Saul that he has power over him with some sleep. What we are meant to see in verse 10 is that our God is powerful. That this world and sin and Satan and our flesh and death and sickness and natural disasters, wars and rulers and the balls and the Sauls of our life, they may seem powerful, but not like our God. Not like our God. It doesn't matter if we are outnumbered 5-1. God needs no weapons. He only needs sleep. And we see that with Jesus Christ. Jesus won the greatest victory, the greatest battle that's ever been fought in the history of humankind, and he didn't use a weapon, just a cross. That's all he did. I pray that. That's my cue. Sermon is ended. I pray that you will trust in the power of God. He just has to